Good morning, class. Today we're going to discuss some of the readings that you guys did for homework this week. The first question that we're going to talk about relating to your readings is, what is the relationship between schooling/education and the development of a public identity? Should the development of a national or public identity be a goal of public education? Why or why not? Can anyone give me an answer for this? Yes, Vivian?
Okay, I read Ain't No Making It by McLeod, and I specifically focused on James, who's one of the brothers. And James talked a lot about how when he was in high school, he didn't have a public identity, but then once he graduated high school and entered the workforce as a computer programmer, he felt like he did need a public identity. And one specific example that he talked about was an instance at work where a white woman had an outburst and wasn't punished, but James knew that if he acted this way, then he would have gotten fired or faced harsher consequences. And a quote from this section that James said is, "Race plays a factor in every single thing that happens every day. What she did was really unprofessional, and the sad part about it is, if that was me acting like that, somebody would have said something." So this just explains how he does have a public identity and he doesn't necessarily think it's a good thing, but he does acknowledge that he thinks it's necessary for his success and work.
Next we'll hear from Seba.
Yeah.
In The Hunger of Memory by Richard Rodriguez, on page 204, he says, "My teachers gave me a great deal more than I knew when they taught me to write public English. I was unable then to use the skill for deeply personal purposes. Nevertheless, the skill of public writing was gradually developed by the many classroom papers I had to compose. Today I can address an anonymous reader, and this seems to me important to say. Somehow the inclination to write about my private life in public is related to my ability to do so." And from here he went on to write this autobiography in which he clearly and openly contrasts between his private identity at home and the public identity which he was able to develop at school. He credits much of his success to the separation of these two, as he articulates his main thesis as a primary reason for my success in the classroom was that I couldn't forget that schooling was changing me and separating me from the life I enjoyed before becoming a student, which he writes on page 47. This is why I think that Richard Rodriguez would argue that a public education is primarily and solely for the development of a public identity.
Thanks for your responses, students. It sounds like a common theme between the readings that you did was arguing for the development of a public identity was a main goal of public education. Another reading that we didn't have time to get to in our class was by Laborie called Public Goods, Private Goods. It talks about 3 different goals of education, one of them being the goal of democratic equality. Here's a quote from the article. "From the perspective of democratic equality, schools should make Republicans. This educational goal supports the overall goal of public education, being to develop a national identity, because schools should prepare students to exist and contribute to democratic societies." Now we're going to move on to the next question, and I want to hear more about the readings that you guys did this week. Our next question is, what should be the main purposes and goals of K-12 public schools in the U.S. and why?
I read Troubling Education by Kumashiro, which talked about how the goal of K-12 public education should be to incorporate anti-oppressive education and teach students to think critically about systems of oppression. There were 4 main approaches that Kumashiro talked about, which were education about the other, education for the other, education that's critical of privileging and othering, and education that changes students and society. And something that these all had in common was the importance of teaching students about other groups and also making sure that students who are in other groups feel included in the conversation, both in school and outside in the real world. And it also talked about the importance of having safe spaces for those students to discuss these issues, but most importantly, teaching students the skills to think critically about oppression and how to make changes in systems.
Seems like Selma really wanted to answer, so we're going to hear from her next.
Rodriguez argues that schooling should give one the knowledge to practice reflection as a means of thinking and immediate action. Yet he recognizes that this is not an easy process to teach. In order to teach reflection, he argues that school must be a place where students can absorb what he considers public knowledge so that they can develop the identity they wish to present to the world. More specifically, he describes public education as a long, unglamorous, even demeaning process. Thus, schools have the obligation to challenge students outside of their comfort zones and make them critical of their own lives.
So it sounds like we have another main theme between the readings, which is helping students develop critical thinking skills in public education. Another reading that we didn't have time to get to was Paulo Freire's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which also talks about encouraging critical thinking skills among students in opposition to the banking concept of education, so that we can stop the cycle of oppression which continually inhibits the success of racial minority students and students of the middle class. A quote that I can draw from Freire's paper is, "The more students work at storing the deposits entrusted to them, the less they develop the critical consciousness which would result from their intervention in the world as transformers of that world." So again, thinking about the goal of public education being to develop students with critical thinking abilities so that they'll be able to change the world and they can undermine and defeat the oppressors.
So I have a child in your class, and I just want to know about what your teaching philosophies are in terms of what the goals and purposes of public education is in the school, and what you do in your what kind of philosophy you follow in your classroom.
Yeah, so personally in my classroom, a lot of my teaching philosophy is inspired by a quote I read in Ezra Normani's New York Times op-ed. And the quote is, "Merit demands excellence and rigor. It is not, as its critics often insist, an elitist, classist, or racist issue. It acknowledges that all kids have talents, even though talents are not distributed equally. It is our obligation as parents and teachers to nurture each child's individual spark and make sure that all children have the chance to be the best they can be." And building off this quote, I believe that the student-teacher relationship is one of the most important elements of a K-12 education. And within this relationship, I think that assessment should play a role as a point of reflection and an opportunity for growth for both the student and the teacher. And I argue that schools should balance different forms of assessment to support and challenge the strengths of all students.
As a student, I believe that the main purpose of K-12 education should be to prepare students for their next steps, whatever that may be, and teach them to think critically about important and current issues. And the use of standardized assessments are not always the best way to assess these types of skills because they unfairly judge students' abilities in the classroom. And when I read Beyond Testing by Deborah Meyer, they talked about the use of portfolios and lots of other alternative methods as a way to assess students. And one quote that stuck out to me from that was, "The use of portfolios constitutes a way for students to learn knowledge, skills, and dispositions crucial to school success and full participation in democracy. It also does not view students as a collection of deficits, but instead builds on what they know, care about, can do, and pushes the students to challenge themselves." So I thought this just really summarized the importance of having different types of assessments other than standardized testing because they evaluate students for their more true abilities.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that you guys both gave your opinions, and teacher, I am glad that you have the intention to help prepare my student to enter into the world, and I like what your input was on standardized testing. I was worried about that for my child because they're not as good at standardized testing as maybe some other children, and I strongly believe that the purpose of K-12 education should be to prepare students to become active members of societies with critical thinking abilities, which is where I think I agree with you that standardized testing can't always show this. And I want to make sure that my child has the ability to question what they see in the world and can work to overturn oppressive systems and not work to continue this cycle of social reproduction.
Linnea, as a student in Introduction to Education Studies, can you describe what you think is the ideal relationship between the student's home, school, and community context?
Absolutely, I can. So I think it's really important that the home and like school are both places where I, as a student, can learn, but I am learning different things. But those skills that I'm learning at home and at school can be complementary to one another, so they can help me to understand and support the community that I'll enter into my later life, whether that is college or a different vocational track. Like I said, I think there should be connection between the home and the school. One article that I read in my educational studies class by Dewey was kind of explaining that home is, if we take an example from an ideal home where the parent is intelligent enough to recognize what's best for the child and is able to supply what is needed, we find the child learning through the social converse and constitution of the family. So I think this is really important because it is encouraging that I'm learning at home, but that home isn't always necessarily the right structure because I need to be surrounded by peers. And that being said, like, I think it's important for me to, again, be learning from my home and be learning from my school, so that I can better understand and support and interact with my community.
Yeah. As a parent, I definitely agree with what you were saying about the importance of the connection between home, school, and community life. As a parent, I try to help my children by teaching them skills at home that they can apply to school and also create a safe environment in which they feel comfortable. I think it's really important to maintain a strong connection with children and with your family because it helps later in life to have that support network to fall back on, and it also can really help with school when students are able to feel comfortable expressing their true selves like they would at home. When I read Hunger of Memory by Rodriguez, something that really stuck out to me was how he described the loss of connection with his family that happened over time when he sort of had a very separate identities between his home and school life. And one quote that stuck out to me was from the end of the book when he's talking to his family again, and he says, I take it to my father and place it on him. In that instant, I feel the thinness of his arms. He turns, he asks if I'm going home now, too. It is, I realize, the only thing he has said to me all evening. And I think this just shows the loss of connection due to the disconnect between Rodriguez's home and school life, and just shows the importance of maintaining healthy relationships throughout education.
Thank you both. It's really valuable for me to hear as a teacher, and I definitely agree and believe that a student's home, school, and community all play such important roles in a student's educational journey, and in order for a student to fully engage in their learning, I think that all three of these contexts can't be solely future-oriented. I think it's really important for students to have goals, but I think if they only see their time in school as a stepping stone to their next job or next academic endeavor, then they'll be too afraid to make mistakes that I believe are necessary for growth. And so as a teacher, I know that I can't have a ton of influence on a student's home or community lives, but I can try to help find ways to help them think abstractly and practice those skills that I hope they'll carry into their home and community contexts.